Blog Talk Radio.
Namaste, good evening, good afternoon, good morning from wherever in the world or wherever throughout consciousness you may be. This is Nature of Reality Radio. I'm your host, Andrew Fisher, broadcasting from the suburbs of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Usually do shows Wednesdays, but today is a special show because of all these technical issues I've been having involving not being able to use Direct Connect and Blog Talk Radio having a glitch. We are doing a special Thursday show today. Tonight on the show, we will be having Brian Tuohy, who is an expert on the subject of sports being rigged, the illegal gambling market's connection to sports, and he's even written a book on martial law and continuation of government, which we will be talking about that as well, briefly. But first of all, the news. For those of you astrology fans, it's interesting to note that there is a Mercury retrograde going on, and Sean Cohen, who was the first ever guest on my show, sent me a message on Facebook telling me that when there's a Mercury retrograde like the one we're having now, there's communication issues. So if any of you have been having communication issues recently, like I certainly have had with the Blog Talk Radio system, that Mercury retrograde might have something to do with it. And yes, I do not believe astrology is a fraud. I believe it is genuine, but that is a different subject altogether. Now, the news, courtesy of Infowars.com. And it's interesting that Brian Tuohy's on my show because there's a connection to Alex Jones. I did get to mention that when I first tried to have Brian on, but I didn't hear what he had to say about it, so I guess we'll cover that again. I learned Alex is obviously lying when he says that he knows what people are going to say, and that's why he interrupts so much. But moving on to the news, actually. Study claims global warming will cause more rapes. Latest fear-mongering pushed by global warming advocates. Well, there is no global warming, and how it can cause rapes, I don't know. They think they're that stupid that they'll actually make up something like this and use a lie that doesn't even exist, like global warming. It was the Club of Rome's idea to create global warming, people. That's where the money leads and all. Next headline, cops backed Texas restaurant that illegally kicked vet, service dog out. Subheadline, I don't see why you need the dog, cop told vet. Well, why do the cops support this? I don't know. You could say what you want about a Texas restaurant being privately owned and being able to kick people out and all, but they say they illegally kicked him and the service and his dog out. I don't have time to go into this interesting story to read, though, I bet. You read it here first. Government spies on innocent people via webcams, laptops, and Xbox. Latest Snowden leak confirmed story. Infowars first broke 8 years ago. Well, NSA spying's been going on a lot more than that. It's called the Telecommunications Act of 1996, but it doesn't surprise us at all. Wonder how many more leaks Snowden is going to give out. I'm sure he doesn't want to do it all at once. He'll probably do it little by little. He's not a sock puppet or a double agent who works for the government. No, folks, that's not the case. People have looked at this. He's a genuine whistleblower. Don't buy into that stuff about him being someone who works for the government. Let's see here. Central banker appointed as Prime Minister of Ukraine. Ukraine finally backed in the fold of the IMF and the banksters. Oh, boy. A banker appointed as a politician. I told you the banks rule the government. It's not the other way around. The bankers control the government. One of the greatest political cartoons I ever saw was a person with the label government on him pouring wine and serving food to a fat man at a table. That fat man had the label banker on it, and on the other side of the table was a thin, frail person, and I believe he was labeled something like common citizen or member of the general public. That basically shows that government cares for the bankers and the rest of their Illuminati control freaks, not the common people, even though the common people created the government. IMF vultures swoop to asset stripped Ukraine. Well, you could debate whether or not other people should help the Ukraine because of what's going on or whether Ukraine should solve the problem itself. But it looks like the idea here is to make Ukraine another debt slave, loaning people money that doesn't exist and charging interest on it. That's how you control people through debt, and that's what they probably want to do. The Illuminati does to the Ukraine. So people, let's pay attention to what's happening in Ukraine. It's very important in terms of geopolitical affairs. Next headline, Russia puts fighter jets on combat alerts as tensions mount. Moscow announces massive expansion of global military presence. Well, America is the Roman Empire of the modern era, but Russia would, I guess, be the Roman Empire of Asia. I do believe they invade other countries more than any other country in Asia. Russia does, so this shouldn't come as too much of a shock to you. Putin may seem like he's our enemy, but the people in the Illuminati who control Putin are the same people that control Obama and all the other national governments on planet Earth. Next headline, Russia-related as well. Russia responds to U.S. warning, expands military presence globally. Oh, well, that's just a addendum, I guess, to the other headline that I just went over. Next headline, Ukraine warns Moscow against Russian military movements in Crimea. Yeah, Ukraine doesn't want to have anything to do with Russia. That's the reason they want to join the EU. They don't seem to understand the EU. The protesters don't, that it's a stepping stone to global government. But as I explained before, a lot of the genocide that they had to go with Stalin was ruling Russia. The Ukrainians had to suffer from his genocide, and that's why they think joining the EU will help them. And we need to wake them up that joining the EU is not necessarily a good idea. But that is the news. So without further ado, I will get Brian on, and this show should work. Brian, you are on the air, area code 262. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, and Skype seems to be working fine, so we're not going to have any glitches today. So that's
Hooray.
Good to know. And since I mentioned that thing about Alex, I was able to tell you that on the first time I had you on the show, but I couldn't hear what your response was. But just for the sake of the listeners who aren't aware, a very interesting turn of events here. What happened was I called into the Alex Jones show on Super Bowl Sunday, wanted to tell Alex about sports being rigged, the evidence for it in Philadelphia sports. And since Alex mentioned about 10 minutes earlier that he wanted to have Brian Tuohy on his show, I figured I might as well take 5 measly seconds just to point out that I was going to have Brian on my show, because I figured that would make Alex and I feel more like radio show brothers, if you will. Well, I did the exact opposite. When he first let me on, I told him, by the way, I'm scheduled to have Brian Tuohy on my show, and Alex was like, very interesting, sir. I want to hear about sports. What's your point? And then I said, oh, well, I wanted to, but then Alex said, got to let you go. I can't have people talk about my radio show. Goodbye. Have a nice day. And I was going to say, well, I wanted to talk about evidence that Philly sports is rigged, but this shows that Alex was obviously lying when he says that the reason he interrupts people so much is because he knows what people are going to say. He obviously didn't know what I was going to say, and I voiced my displeasure in an email to showtips@infowars.com. But called in the next day, and I was one of the first people to get on the show, luckily. And Alex, when he answered my phone, said, you wanted to talk about sports being rigged, my friend. Maybe he knew who I was and why I was calling. So all this stuff about Philly sports being rigged, we'll get into it on this show, but I talked about that, and then after I said I emailed Brian about this and talked to them about it, Alex said, you know what, I want to get Brian Tuohy on tomorrow. Tomorrow, guys, please let's get him on the show tomorrow. So I got Brian on the show on Tuesday because I had to call in on Monday because Alex hung up on me after a total misunderstanding on Sunday, and now because of a nice turn of events, I'm having Brian on my show. How fitting. Brian, doesn't that make you feel special?
It actually does, in a way, to be honest. I mean, normally it's good to know that you're remembered. When you go on a show like Alex, or I've been on Coast to Coast and several others, you don't know how well they remember you, if they remember you, or if you're just another shift passing in the night type of thing. So it's kind of good to know that he thought about me enough to consider having me back, and it was cool that you were able to get on and hopefully promote your show a little bit and spread the word, because, this is a subject matter that I think is sorely under-discussed, especially within the sports media, and it makes sense as to why, because it threatens the integrity of sports. And if you threaten the integrity of sports, you're going to threaten basically the bottom line, which is the moneymaker aspect to it all. And if you threaten that, then you're threatening not only the sport itself, but you're threatening the sports media outlets that cover it, who need sports to exist.
Right, and I wanted to give you the floor, I told you, and I will give you the floor, and you'll understand why I'm willing to give you the floor after I tell you this. Now, someone that's skeptical of the work you do would say, there is no way you can prove that sports is rigged, because you can't prove that a player rigged a play on his own volition and his own will. You can't prove that a referee blew a call on his own volition and his own will. They could have just been doing a lousy job, or maybe they did what they thought was right. It's something you can't prove. Now, there are exceptions, like I remember a couple football games where a team is down by 1 point and the team that's winning by a point is on the verge of scoring a touchdown, and then the other team, their defenders all step aside and let the guy score the touchdown. The purpose is to have them score the touchdown and do the extra point, so the other team will have some time left to score a touchdown and hopefully get a 2-point conversion to send the game into overtime. Now, that's a rare exception when it's obvious that the players blew the play and they'll step aside and let them score. But in general, it can't be proven, and that's why someone will want to be skeptical of you. Now, you've backed up your claims on Alex's show, so I basically want to give you the floor. My question for you to silence the skeptics is, how do you know that sports is rigged when you can't prove that a given play was truly rigged?
Well, it's a very good question because it's true. I cannot prove beyond probably a reasonable doubt to some fans that this stuff has been rigged. I mean, let's face it. You point out exactly the problem is if you watch game film, be whatever sport, take your pick, boxing, football, basketball, whatever, you cannot say for certain that that referee made a bad call because it was intentional, or that player made a bad play because it was intentional. It could very well have been just a bad play, and that's perfectly fine. What I try to do, and I kind of get in some trouble with some people, is because they say if everything's fixed, if this is all rigged, and I don't think every game is rigged. I don't think it's professional wrestling. I think it's done at certain strategic times for the leagues to do these sorts of things. But they say if everything is rigged, if I know all this stuff, well then tell me who's going to win the Super Bowl. Tell me who's going to win the World Series. Well, my job isn't predictions. That's not what I do. I'm not a gambler. I don't bet on these things. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not sitting inside the NFL's head office when they're making, these sorts of decisions. I'm not in there when the commissioner's talking to the other owners. I'm not there. Neither are any of the sports writers either, or the sports radio broadcasters, anybody else for that matter. So no one really knows what's going to happen. So if I make a prediction and I'm wrong, then I don't know what I'm talking about. And if I make a prediction and I'm right, and I have done that in the past, then, well, everybody knew that was going to happen, and no big deal. I still don't know what I'm talking about. So it's a lose-lose situation for me. What I try to do is retroactively look at what the result was, whatever that sport was, whatever that game was, and then see, was it set up? Did we have a big media push leading toward that result? And you've seen, I think, many cases where that is exactly what happens. When you have something like Hurricane Katrina, which devastates the city of New Orleans and the whole Gulf Coast for that matter, and then all of a sudden New Orleans becomes the special team within the NFL, and they're pushed and pushed and pushed, and they, the New Orleans Saints single-handedly brought back the city of New Orleans, and the NFL did such a great job in remodeling the Superdome, which really they barely contributed to, but that doesn't matter. That wasn't part of the story. When they have these sorts of stories and then you see the Saints winning the Super Bowl, I say this is way, way, way too coincidental to be just that. It's not coincidental. It's a smart business decision, and it was a pre-planned business decision, and they pushed it into being. And that's what I try to write about. That's what I try to talk about. One of the things that I also got into trouble for is obviously, again, with the proof thing, is when I wrote the second book, this book, Larceny Games, which is all about the FBI's investigation into professional sports and rigging and point shaving, here's the thing. The FBI can't prove their case. Okay, now some people are very leery of the FBI. Some people don't believe they're a legitimate organization. But if you take them at their face value, which I do because I think that they, for the most part, are a legitimate organization and really do their work, then you have to wonder, well, if the FBI has investigated all these games, all these players and coaches and referees, and they have. I mean, I received over 400 files through the Freedom of Information Act on this subject matter, and yet they have yet, since the passage of the Sports Bribery Act in 1964, which made it a federal crime for someone to bribe a player, a coach, or an athlete, or referee, for that matter, to alter the outcome of a game, and yet in relation to professional sports, they've never convicted one person of doing this, ever. So if the FBI can't prove this stuff, why are you coming at me and saying you can't prove it, therefore it never happens? I think that's a big question to ask. I mean, I think these sorts of things are out there. I think it's happened. I mean, for the NFL to say it's never happened is absolutely ridiculous. But I think these things have happened. The problem is there is no concrete evidence. There is nothing that's going to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt to all the doubters out there that these sort of things happen, because let's face it, if you're going to fix a game, be it a gambler or an organized crime guy getting somebody to fix a game, or in my opinion, sometimes a league getting the player, coach, or referee to fix a game, they're not going to write this stuff down. They're going to make sure they're not recorded. There's going to be no proof, no evidence that someone could present that say, see, this happened. And that's the problem for a lot of people, is because you can't provide that smoking gun document that'll prove it all to them. They'll just write it off and say it never happens, regardless of how many coincidental, strange, absurd results they see in these games. they still won't believe that all this smoke and all this evidence that I have produced throughout my writings leads to the actual fire, that some of these games are just flat out not legitimate. And that's basically the gist of it all.
Okay, thanks for covering that. And I wanted to, as an addendum to that whole thing, the people at InfoWars have said that they have actually done some computer analysis of plays in football and other sports where they've done really close viewing to see if they can show that this player did give out on a play, so to speak, to rig the play. And Alex Jones has said that they have done that and seen, there's no way this guy, based on the computer analysis observation, that he was trying an effort. He actually did that on purpose. So would you believe Alex is telling the truth about that you can do that with computers?
I don't know. There's a lot of, the big thing in sports over probably the past 10 years or more has been this whole push toward analytics. And, ever since Freakonomics came out and economists have gotten involved in these sort of things, they've been trying to break down every sport basically based on statistics alone. And, baseball has what they call sabermetrics, where they, get so minute in their details, and they say they can determine how far, a shortstop's range is on a ball and how fast a pitcher should be able to throw the ball and all these things. But yet, despite all these analytics, all these analysis, nobody can tell you who's going to win the World Series this year. With who will say for certain they're going to win against this team in this many games, and that's exactly how it's going to be played out. I just don't think the statistics ever tell you the whole story, especially in relation to what I talk about, because what I talk about, I think, is the anomaly. It's the thing that won't necessarily stand out, and if it does stand out, a lot of researchers and scientists that we've seen, I think, throughout history, push the anomaly aside for their, better purpose. You look at archaeology and all the things that archaeologists have found that shouldn't exist at certain dates and places that exist, and they just say, well, that doesn't matter. And so they throw it aside because my thesis is this, and that doesn't support my thesis, so I throw it away. I think there's a lot of that in the sports and the analytics, and to find things like events of point shaving, things of game fixing, I think it's really, really difficult, because one of the things I don't think you can account for, especially towards fixing the game, are referees not making calls. You know what I mean? When a holding call or, pass interference call or a charging foul or whatever doesn't get called, how do you factor that in? Because that's going to alter the outcome of the game as well. You can balance it for penalties. You can see what penalties have been called, but tell me about the penalties that weren't called and why they weren't called, and try to break that down statistically. I don't think that's possible. I don't think it exists.
Yeah, speaking of referees calling penalties, there is a video on, I think it is your YouTube channel, unless it's someone who's framing you, which shows in the Chicago Bears-Green Bay Packers game on a punt return, the guy scored a touchdown on the punt return, and if he scored the touchdown, it would have broken the spread, but to keep the spread intact, they needed a penalty, and the referees did call a penalty, but what was so interesting about that play is it was almost virtually impossible to see if the guy who was called for the holding penalty did actually hold the guy. And second of all, it took the referee literally 5 to 7 seconds before he finally decided to throw the flag after the guy had already held him. And by then the guy was already dashing down the field on the verge of scoring a touchdown. Would you, in your opinion, call that dead in-your-face proof that the referees are in on some conspiracy to call penalties selectively, and if they are, who are they trying to do it on behalf of?
Well, I don't know if that's a complete 100% solid proof. I think it's definitely evidence toward that. The guy, that was my video, by the way. Yeah. The guy who threw that penalty was 30 yards or more away from where the supposed penalty occurred, and how he could clearly see that was in fact a penalty, and like you say, he took a little while to call it. It makes you wonder, and I think that's one of the key things I tried to argue about, and probably should have actually made clearer when I wrote the Fixes In, is that it's not illegal for a league to fix its own games through the referees, because the referees are their employees, and they can direct their employees how to do their job. And then we can get into it more in terms of the entertainment end of it all and what it all means, but the fact of the matter is if a referee decides to give LeBron James more room to work on the basketball court and call more fouls on people who are trying to defend him from doing what he does best on the basketball court, there's no law that prevents that. He can do that 100% and get away with it, and the fans have no recourse on that sort of thing. So if you're going to fix a game, clearly the referees are one of the best people to choose. Now, if you're an organized crime member or a gambler, that'd be who you go after. If you're a league and you want to control your own games, manipulate them, be it for advertising purposes to keep people watching just into the fourth quarter or to outright change the outcome of a game, the referees are the best people to do it. And so I think you can look, and especially in the NFL this past year, there were so many horrible game-changing calls that the NFL would even retroactively, a couple days after the game, say, yeah, you know what, the referees totally blew that game, but oh well. There's so much of that has occurred. I think people are starting to realize that, you know, this just isn't pure accident. I think there's something going on behind it, and I think the more you see it and the more you look for it as a fan, the more you're willing to admit to yourself that this may be a possibility and let me take a different look at my games and realize that it's a business behind it all and what that business may be trying to accomplish. Then I think you see that some of these referees' calls are done purposefully for specific reasons.
Yes, and one question I have, okay, the referees, you might understand why they would want to do it, but when a player rigs a play, like the Black Sox scandal, the players deliberately lost the World Series on purpose. That was back in the 19-teens. And what really bugs me about this is, why would a player want to do anything that would prevent him from winning a championship? I played Little League Baseball for like 12 years, and I never won a title, but unlike some of my teammates who just wanted the season to be over, I always wanted to win a championship. Well, I can't for the life of me understand, why would a professional athlete blow a play? Wouldn't they want to do whatever they can to win a championship? And if they wouldn't, why wouldn't they want to do that?
Well, I think that's the belief many fans have, and I think it's the projection of themselves onto the players. Because they think, well, geez, if I was lucky enough to be that guy and playing in the NFL or playing in the NBA, I would live up to all the cliches. I would try to give 110% and take it to the next level and all that sort of thing. But the fact of the matter is, for a lot of these players, especially players who've been in the league for a little more than just a year or two, it's a job. It's a grind. It's not just, an easy cakewalk job. I mean, it's actually difficult. And it's hard, and, some guys, they're just happy to collect their paychecks and move on. There was a book written by, and I forget his name off the top of my head, but he's a former NFL player, and it's called The Dark Side of the Game. I think Tim Green was the guy who wrote it. And he played for, I think it was the Atlanta Falcons, and the Falcons played in the playoffs, and it was like the wild card round, and they lost in that first round. And he wrote in the book that on the plane flight home, they were celebrating that they lost. They were happy that they lost because, according to him, they knew they weren't good enough to get to the Super Bowl. Believe that or don't. But they were just happy that the season was over. They were thrilled. They were partying on the plane because, thank God, the season's finally over. So, I think there are players out there who really don't care that much about a ring. If they get a championship, great. If they don't, they're still making a good amount of money, and that's plenty because they suffer through a lot of injuries, a lot of physical pain, and a lot of emotional stress as well doing what they do. And when the season's over, I think it's a big relief for them. And at the same time, I think another reason you can get players to fix games, the reason you can get them to shave points, is because they are human. And because they are human, they have problems. And that's another thing a lot of people don't consider, I think, about players and athletes, is that they're human beings, and they have their own weaknesses. They have problems with their wives. They have problems with their families. They have drug problems. They have gambling problems. They have all sorts of problems, and that can be exploited by people who want to exploit them. And the mafia, of course, has a decades, centuries-long history of exploiting people's weaknesses and getting them to do what they want them to do. And I think you can do that with players if you get that toehold in with that player. And the same thing, you have a player who may have a gambling problem, who may have a drug problem, who's already getting in deep with the wrong sort of people. And when they get in too deep, and let's face it, not every NFL player, not every NBA player, Major League Baseball player are truly millionaires, despite what people say. Some make the league minimum and yet have great impacts on the game. They can blow through money very fast, be broke. And we've seen players who've made $100 million in the NBA come out broke, like Allen Iverson and Antoine Walker. These are the type of people that get into problems, and they can be exploited. And I think that's how you can do it. You can either do it through a person's greed, through their natural, want of more money. I think you can do it through blackmail. I think there's many ways to get to these athletes And just because you assume as a fan that they all want to win the championship, it's not right. It's kind of a naive approach to take. It's a job for many of these guys, and many of these guys are just out to make a buck and try to make their career last as long as they can in a certain sense.
Okay, and I want to talk about some specific sports stuff. I've heard Alex Jones say a couple times that when he's referenced your work, he says that basketball, I'm assuming he means the NBA, is the sport that is rigged the most. So let's cover that for a moment. Why the NBA? Why basketball? And how do you rig it if you rig it?
Well, let's face it. If you tried to rig a basketball game and you get one player, you own 20% of the team if you get one starting player. So a team that's playing 100% against a team that's 80%, who's going to win? The team at 100%, right? I mean, that's just kind of the nature. And same with referee. I mean, you get an NBA referee or even a college referee for that matter, and they can have so much control over a game, and it's all, a lot of it with the refereeing and officiating in any sport is so subjective. You know, when you have in basketball, you have a collision between two players. Was it charging? Was it blocking? Well, what's the referee want to call it? I mean, just little simple things like that can tweak a game, especially in the college level where, you know, guys foul out so often and can get into foul problems so fast. You put two quick fouls on a team star player in the first half, and that team's handicapped right off the bat. I mean, basketball is a very easy game to get to, and if you're from a gambling perspective, if you're going to shave points, it's a very easy game to shave points in as well. So I think it's very susceptible to that sort of influence. But many people think that the NBA has gone on to almost the professional wrestling level where it's really manipulated by the league itself. And I think you kind of do see a lot of evidence of that. You see how many times it just takes the star player on one team, and that's the team that winds up the championship. I mean, I don't remember the stats anymore, but I think over the past 20, 25 years, probably 80% or more of the NBA titles have been won by, like, LeBron James, Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, and those type of guys, Tim Duncan. I mean, just like literally a handful of 5 guys have won the most championships or been involved in the NBA Finals over the past 25 years to make you wonder, well, is this really a team sport, or is it a sport now where they're just trying to promote and make these elite stars the main attraction to the detriment of the league in many people's idea, because the NBA isn't basketball anymore. It's completely different, and there's really only about 5 to 8 franchises that matter. The rest of them are also rants and could be eliminated for that matter because nobody cares about them, and they're not going to succeed the way the NBA plays right now. So I think it's an easy game to manipulate if you want it to be manipulated.
All right, in some other sports where it was admittedly rigged, I remember one time when you appeared on the Alex Jones show, a woman called in and said, where's the proof? And you said, well, you can't prove a given play. But I remember Alex Jones saying that in newspapers in India, it was admitted that cricket matches were rigged. And the day after the Super Bowl where the Ravens beat the 49ers 2 Super Bowls ago, it would appear in the New York Times that the day after that event, that soccer matches all around the world had been rigged, and it kind of makes you wonder, are they trying to tell us right in our face in a subliminal way, we rigged the Super Bowl yesterday, here's evidence that shows we do it all the time. Getting back to those specific stories, could you get into the stuff about cricket matches being rigged in India and the soccer matches all around the world being rigged?
Well, I think that's one of the pieces of evidence that kind of show that American sports are not as pure as a lot of people believe they are, because like you mentioned, cricket in India is incredibly corrupt, and it's actually been corrupted in other places as well. I mean, I think they had some Pakistani team get in trouble for who actually rigged games when they played England, and there's been others as well. And soccer is the biggest one. I mean, because soccer is, in fact, the world's game. I mean, the World Cup is the biggest sporting event in the world. It's bigger than the Super Bowl. More people watch the World Cup, I think, like 3 times as many than watch the Super Bowl. And it generates the most money, and here we got one coming up in Brazil, and we know for a fact, it's been proven, that World Cup soccer matches have been fixed, that they've been rigged, and they've been rigged not only by gamblers and organized crime, but they are actually rigged on a state level. I mean, there's a story, and I never forget what 2 countries, but 2 South American countries, basically one country had their team laid down because of political pressure and political prisoners in another country. I mean, that's how much these games have been fixed. So I think when you look around the world and you see that soccer matches have been fixed, and I think the report you're referring to was with Europol, which is the national organization for the EU, the police state, or police force, I should say. It's not a police state yet, but a police force there. And they said 680 soccer matches have been rigged around the world, like knowingly rigged. And tennis is incredibly corrupt. And there's a lot of betting and gambling and game fixing going on in tennis, and it has been for decades. Guys are known to throw matches and fix games, fix little things within the games. Like I say, cricket, rugby has been suspect. There's other sports as well. But the fact of the matter is that supposedly none of this has ever touched the shores of the United States. And I don't believe it because the United States is corrupt. Let's face it. There's all sorts of corruptions running around in government, in big business, unfortunately, even in, the church. And yet supposedly we think our sports are pure and that nobody affects them. Well, if it's happening all over the globe in all these other sports, how can we be so naive to believe that this doesn't happen here?
Yeah, we shouldn't be naive about it. And I want to get into a list of sorts here. Let's ignore the fact that players may intentionally rig an event. Just for the sake of it, so the fans here can have something to think about, can you list, possibly, all the sports that you can think of to the best of your ability, like maybe from the easiest to the hardest to rig? Which sports, when you're talking about the referees trying to rig the event, just the referees, just the umpires, the officials, which sports, make a list here, would be the easiest and which would be the hardest if the only people you have to rig the events are the referees, umpires, and judges?
Well, let's see. The judges, obviously, you could say ice skating, if you want to get down to it, because we know that's happened, and it probably just happened in this past Olympics. Boxing judges have been gotten to numerous times and have altered the outcome of fights. And in fact, I talked to a boxing manager just the other day who said he paid off judges. He's done it. He's paid off athletic commissions, in fact, to get results he wanted. So that can easily happen, and I'm sure it can happen in the UFC as well. If it can happen in boxing, the UFC is basically a mirror image of boxing, so that can happen. In team sports, I think, again, basketball is one of the easiest ones to manipulate if you're talking either way, point shaving or the outcome of a game. Football would be quite easy as well. Hockey, it can happen in hockey as well because obviously the more penalties you award, the more power plays you give a team, the more likely they are to score and win a game. I think even in baseball. In baseball, don't think really umpires can manage games, but if you think about the strike zone, the home plate umpire has a lot of control. And if you get that first pitch that's a borderline pitch, if he wants to put pressure on the hitter, he can call it a strike. If he wants to put pressure on the pitcher, he can call it a ball. And you do enough of that over the course of a game, it can sway a game. I mean, obviously it's not going to stop the ball from going over the fence if a guy hits a home run, but it can still, that's enough pressure sometimes to alter the outcome of a game, and that's all you need. If you're a gambler, and even if you're a league, all you need is just that little percentage in your favor, and it's going to, over the long haul, make sure you win more games than you lose.
Okay, and I'd like you to spend a little bit of time talking about your work looking at FBI stuff. You did briefly touch on this earlier, but go into a little bit of detail here. The Freedom of Information Acts that you filed, I believe you said that after filing all these Freedom of Information Acts with the FBI, you did find that the illegal gambling market has a vested interest in what goes on in the professional and even the collegiate sports level. Talk about this all you want. You got the floor on this. Elaborate on those Freedom of Information Acts, what they were about, and what exactly did you find in them, the things that we should know.
Well, in relation to sports, what I came to find right as I was finishing writing the fixes in was that the FBI had actually investigated this sort of thing, and I was a little naive myself at the time. And what it was is, again, there was this act passed in 1964 called the Sports Bribery Act, and it made it a federal crime, which it wasn't before that, for someone to bribe a player, a coach, or a referee to alter the outcome of a game. And at that point in time, it basically charged the FBI with investigating then any sort of tip or lead relating to this sort of crime. And the FBI took it on wholeheartedly. They set up a network of sources and informants all across the United States at that time, and they began to get tips and information from all sorts of people relating exactly to this. So when I learned about that, then I had to discover how to figure out how to get these files out of the FBI, and having never filed a Freedom of Information Act request before, I had a lot of learning to do, because it wasn't like using Google. You couldn't just send in a request saying, give me all your files on the NFL, and the FBI would say, here. You had to figure out kind of how to work the system. And it took, actually, what I did is I found a guy online who was kind enough to help me. He does a lot of this, and he actually works, he claims, for a secret government agency, if you believe it. And the more I've gotten to know him, I actually do believe it because of the information he knows. But he taught me how to do this and how to properly format and ask my questions. And once I got kind of these keys to the kingdom, then the FBI was very helpful, and they sent me everything I asked for, supposedly if they could find it. And that wound up amounting to over 400 files I got over the course of probably 2 years or so. I still get files in the mail today. But there was 400 specific files related to the Sports Bribery Act, and they basically went from 1964 until the mid-1980s, and at that point in time, the FBI basically quit investigating for this sort of thing, if you believe it. And that's the scary part to me, is that the FBI is supposed to do this job, and they don't do it, and they've allowed the leagues to do it themselves. But within those files, within those 400 files in the span of about 20 years, there's stuff relating to the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, college football, college basketball, horse racing, boxing, and a lot of other things as well. And within those files, I was able to find other files that I could request and get that even expanded more onto the FBI's dig into professional sports and into collegiate sports and all the things that they knew. And it's amazing that the FBI had this information and was able to look into these things, and yet none of this stuff ever became public. And that's the kind of the fascinating part to me, is they knew that certain, like, Hall of Famers, I mean, literally Hall of Famers in football, Hall of Famers in basketball, who were gambling on games within their own sports, and yet because it wasn't a crime, it wasn't a violation of the Sports Bribery Act, the FBI didn't do anything with this information. It's not even, many times I don't even think they interacted with the sports leagues and handed it over to them. They just found out what they found out and then let it go. And that's like I say, the scary part to me is that they knew some serious information about players that I think would change people's opinions of them once they read my book and realize what's in there, what the FBI knew.
Okay, and I want to talk about a specific area of sports. I did send you a couple of emails back in the day about this. I don't know if you remember them, but about that stuff I said about Philadelphia sports being rigged. I just want to elaborate on this for a moment for those people that don't know. I used to be a big fan of sports until people like Brian Tuohy and Alex Jones woke me up to the fact that there's a lot of dirty laundry in the sports world. I'm not a sports fan I used to be, but I was, and I followed Philadelphia pro sports very closely, and Philadelphia sports fans went through massive suffering for 25 years. The Philadelphia 76ers won the NBA title in 1983, and it wasn't until the Philadelphia Phillies in 2008 won the World Series that 25 freaking years, people. No other sports town that had 4 teams had to go that long without a title, and Philadelphia sports teams went through many playoff runs in that time span. First of all, a mathematics professor determined that the probability that the Eagles, Flyers, Phillies, and Sixers could have gone those 25 years without a championship with all the playoff runs was 1 in 50,700, and that was actually in 2007 when he did that. It would be a little higher because of a couple of playoff runs in the year time frame before the Phillies won the World Series about a year later. But, Brian, I talked to you about this and said, would they want to screw around with the sports fans of a specific city, like maybe the Illuminati or some other hidden force that would want to screw around with the sports fans of that town and make them go through massive suffering, like the extent that Philadelphia sports fans had to go through? I mean, it may not be as bad as Cleveland because they haven't won a title since '64, but they only have 3 teams. There is a little difference there. But and you told me, yeah, maybe Philadelphia sports, they didn't really have an owner that would really get in the face of the league, and because of that, they wouldn't want the Philly teams to win a title. And Philadelphia sports fans, they always keep going back to the teams, regardless of how many times they keep losing in the playoffs. They always have a reputation for coming back. So just to screw around with them, maybe they would do that. But could you maybe explain is there really evidence that they would screw around with a team like they might have done with Philly? Can you think of any reasons?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, one of the things I think, because I get emails from people like Detroit Lion fans and Cleveland Brown fans who say, well, how come, it hasn't been our turn yet to win a title? And I say, well, I think part of what the leagues want to do is because they want to make money, they need something to promote and to push and to get, sell jerseys and T-shirts and all that sort of thing. And certain teams like the Lions and the Browns, for example, haven't had a star player worthy of promotion, and I think that's part of the deal, especially like in the NFL. Is the NFL pushes star quarterbacks. The NBA pushes the likes of Kobe and LeBron and some of these other guys, and it's amazing how many times you see these star quarterbacks in the Super Bowl then win the Super Bowl, and how many times you see the Kobe's and LeBrons get to the finals and win the finals, and I don't think that's just because they're great players. I think it's because that's the marketing, that's the strategy, that's the promotion, that's what they're pushing, that's what they're selling, and people want to buy into great players. And as they say in psychological terms, bask in reflected glory. You're a fan of Tom Brady. He wins the Super Bowl. You feel a lot better about yourself. And I think that's part of the problem. Is I don't know that really, the Sixers had Allen Iverson, the Eagles had Donovan McNabb. There have been star players there, but were they really those nationally headline-grabbing star players that pushed the league, wanted the league to make them superstar players? I don't know. It's hard to say. But I think that's, if you look at the way they promote things, the way they push things, I think that's the way these leagues operate and want to operate. So I think that's why, like you say, in the NBA, there's only really 5 or 6 franchises that matter. The rest are also rants, and I think that's the same with football. You need that superstar player to push you over the edge within the league itself, within the commissioner's office, if you will, in order to get that title. And I think, like I say, I think the Eagles and a lot of the other Philadelphia teams lack that and have lacked that, and that's why they didn't get the championships.
Yes, and speaking of that, on a related note, I did send you another message, and you found it quite interesting. The day before the Phillies won that 2008 World Series, Bud Selig, the baseball commissioner, appeared on Baseball Tonight to talk about
I remember
the
you talking about this.
Yes, and Bud Selig, the ESPN Baseball Tonight anchors, asked him, are there any special plans if the Tampa Bay Rays were to win Game 5 and send the series back to Tampa? And I think they were going to say more, but Bud Selig interrupted them. It seemed like he was trying to interrupt them, and he said, I don't think we'll be going anywhere, which suggests that he knew that the Phillies were going to win the series the next day in Game 5 at home. And unless he did some sort of an astrological reading or something, which proved that the Phillies would win the next day, I can't imagine why he would have said that unless he knew the Phillies were going to win the next day. And unfortunately, I tried to do some research on this to see if there's any archive of this episode, but apparently there isn't, so I can only ask people to believe me on faith here. But with this being said, do you think this is very compelling evidence that Selig knew, and do you think all the commissioners are in on this? Something like this?
It wouldn't surprise me. There's been a lot of little things like that I've heard, that I myself have heard, and other people like you have pointed out to me, where it seems like a league or commissioner or someone has foreknowledge of the results before it takes place. And that's not necessarily proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's more evidence to add to the heaping pile of evidence that should make any sports fan reconsider what they think to be true and real about their leagues that they love. And I think that's one of the things. I've heard a lot of times, and you hear it an awful lot of times, especially in relation to the NFL, where they say it couldn't have been scripted better than this. And it's like, why would you even mention that? Why would you bring that up unless maybe you have scripted it? Maybe you have written it up and this is what you determined to happen. One of the things I found, or someone actually pointed out to me, is there was an interview just before the Super Bowl with Commissioner Goodell of the NFL, and they were talking about the expansion of the playoffs in the NFL, and just out of the blue, for no good reason, Roger Goodell, like in the middle of his little speech about, expanding the playoffs, he said, one of the great things about our league is the playoffs, and the other great thing about our league is the fact that none of this is scripted. And then he kind of kept talking, and it was like, who is even telling you that it was scripted, or who's even bringing up this comment? I mean, what made him say that? I mean, it was just kind of an off-the-wall comment for him to make, and it didn't even fit in with what he was talking about. It was really strange, but there's been a lot of these sorts of things that have just kind of almost like a slip of the lip type of thing that should, if you could catch them all and put them all in order, like in a video or something like that, I think it would make people just be like, well, what the heck does all that mean?
Yeah, it would make you wonder. By the way, just let me take a moment here to point out, if anybody wants to call in, has a question for Brian, the show call-in number is 646-478-4747. Again, 646-478-4747. Feel free to call in, ask about sports, ask about martial law and continuation of government. We'll get into that maybe in a half an hour at the earliest. But staying with the sports subject, one thing that seems to be noticeable, especially in football from what I've seen, is the tightness in games. The games, one person calling into the Alex Jones show recently pointed this out, saying that games are getting more tighter. There are no more blowouts. And is that, to the best of your research, because I seem to recall seeing something on your website where you look at games to see if the spread was met or the over-under, and would you say that the consistencies between the overs and unders in football and other sports and the spreads is very convincing enough to say it's designed and rigged to be this perfect?
Well, a lot of people have asked me, or have claimed themselves, that, the NFL must be working with Las Vegas, and that they kind of manipulate things to screw bettors and gamblers. And in all honesty, for my research, and I don't necessarily believe that to be true, because one of the guys I spoke to for my book Larceny Games was the former head of the Stardust Sportsbook in Las Vegas when it was the premier sports book in the 1980s. I mean, it was the place to be and the place to be seen, and they basically set the betting line for everyone in the country. And this guy was very open and honest when I first talked to him. In fact, I was a little leery because when they, you tell people, geez, I investigate fixed games and I think the league's fixed their own games, you never know how someone's going to react to that right off the bat. And when I mentioned this to him, he was like, oh, yeah, I believe that. I believe that happens all the time. So he was kind of a kindred spirit and very open to talking about this. And he said, in his whole time running the place, and this is, 10 years, and he spent even more time in Las Vegas before that, he never heard from a league once ever. I mean, there was no communication, no contact, no nothing between him, his sports book, and the leagues. So, maybe that's changed since he left. Maybe it's changed in the 90s and the modern era, but I don't necessarily think that's the case. But I do find it amazing, and it's really amazing how good these sports books and these gamblers can be at predicting the line, predicting the point spread, predicting the over-unders, and how many times, it'll fall on one side or the other. It's almost 50-50. They're pretty remarkable in that regards. But I think more in terms of the tightness of games, especially in the NFL, I think that's manipulated by the NFL itself, and I don't think it's for gambling purposes. I think it's to keep people watching. Now, at the same time, many people are watching because they are gambling on these games, and that's a completely different subject matter. But I think the NFL wants, because they're so dependent on television. Now, let's face it, the NFL makes over $10 billion a year now, I think, and about $6 billion of that comes directly from the TV networks, and it's really from 4 of the 5 biggest media conglomerates in the United States. And I think if you look, the NFL is the only business that makes a majority of its money from these major media conglomerates. I mean, they're the only one. They exist because major media wants them to exist. If they pulled that funding, there would be no NFL tomorrow. They couldn't afford it. But basically, television pays every player, every coach, every referee salary. I mean, they really do. With that $6 billion they give the NFL a year, and the NFL wants to continue to make more money. The only way you can make more money is to get more and more costly television contracts, more money out of these networks and the likes of DirecTV and otherwise. And I think they have to cater to that. And that's why I think that's one of the evidence and one of the proofs that this sort of thing happens is because the only way they can make money, the only way they can continue to be so profitable is to keep people watching. And how do you keep people watching? Something that they see. I mean, if you've seen one football game, really, you've seen them all. It's kind of the same thing. It just repeats and it repeats and repeats, and different teams win and different players come in. But it's kind of the same thing every time you watch. But they have to keep it exciting. They have to keep people watching, and they need people watching into the fourth quarter because, they've sold ad time all the way till the end of the game. And the people who invest in the fourth quarter ads want the same kind of return that the people with the first quarter ads. I mean, and the NFL has already changed itself because of television. I mean, the 2-minute warning exists because of television. I mean, they put it in there to sell advertising, and they knew that if people were watching at the end of the game, if they stopped the 2-minute warning when hopefully the tension was at its highest in the game, they could then sell people stuff because they would hit them with ads when their emotions are most out of whack from watching these sporting events. I mean, that's why the 2-minute warning exists. And many people, I don't think, realize it. I think they always thought it was in the game. No, they put it in there specifically for television, specifically for selling you advertising. And that's why they put on these games, because they need people to watch. It's one of the few things that people will continue to watch live is professional sports, even college sports. And it's there to sell advertising. It's there to make them money. And so I think that's why these games, especially in NFL, and it's been record-setting in the past couple of years. More and more games have been coming down to the final play, if not the final 2 minutes of the game. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's manipulated and controlled and intentional.
Yeah, and it also makes you wonder if the fact that a lot of rallies happen, like a team is on the verge of a blowout and then the other team scores a lot of runs. I mean, the team that was in the lead wins, but it kind of makes you wonder, do they just rig it to keep the fans in it just to let yeah, exactly. And speaking of rallies, I'd like to get into one specific game that was such a miracle. I'm sure you looked into it because it had to make you wonder, was this rigged to happen? I'm talking about the Eagles-Giants miracle at the New Meadowlands game where the Eagles were down by 3 touchdowns, 21 points with like 17:28 left. And then they scored 4 touchdowns, including a walk-off punt return for a touchdown at the end. And there was one specific play that was really questionable for me, the Brent Selleck touchdown that basically was the first touchdown in the Eagles rally. It looked like the player who was going to tackle Brent Selleck as he was trying to catch the ball, like he missed the tackle. It was such a lousy tackling job. It kind of made me wonder, did he do that on purpose? Why would he do that? But that game, the probability the Eagles could have pulled off that victory makes you wonder, and I'm sure you looked into it. Was there anything in that game, especially that fourth quarter comeback, which suggests that game was rigged?
I remember that game, and I do kind of remember thinking, "Wow, that was really weird." But there's been a lot of games like that. I mean, there's just the game this past season between the Broncos and the Patriots. I don't remember if it was a Sunday night or a Monday night game where the Broncos were just destroying the Patriots in the first half. And in the second half, the Patriots had this just amazing comeback, and it was like the Broncos forgot how to play football in the second half. You see that, and it's, again, I remember, like I say, I remember that specific Eagles-Giants game, and it's hard to say. It's really hard to say if that was a miracle comeback. Let's face it, sports does lend itself to that sort of change in fortunes. But at the same time, when you think about it on a professional level, if you're that professional and you're that good and you're the elite of the league, who these players are, who've made it to the league, how does something like that happen? How do you just completely and utterly fall apart? And same thing with this past Super Bowl between the Seahawks and the Broncos. I mean, how does Peyton Manning and the Broncos just completely fall apart from the first play on? I mean, just done. Like, they didn't even show up that day. Like, they were just done. How does that happen? I don't know. But it makes me wonder how legitimate is all this stuff, because enough questions can be raised, enough questions can be asked, and they're legitimate questions. I mean, I think for somebody to call me a conspiracy theory because I question, or a conspiracy theorist because I question the stuff is wrong. I'm just skeptical of what happened because I don't believe it. And I've seen enough sports, I've watched enough sports, I've done enough research into these games to think something's just not on the level.
Yes, I want to talk about another specific game. I don't know if it was a game or a series, but when you were on the Alex Jones show last couple Tuesdays ago, I did hear you reference something about in Major League Baseball, something in 2012 about a series being rigged. I'm not quite sure what that was all about. Could you please elaborate on what that was all about?
Well, unfortunately, I can't completely elaborate on it. It's something I'm still working on, actually. And it wasn't a series, it was a game. I had evidence that Major League Baseball says they haven't had a game fixed since the 1919 World Series with the Black Sox, which is what you mentioned at the start of the show. And, I don't believe that, and many gamblers and bookmakers won't believe that either. But Major League Baseball can say that because no one's ever been convicted of such a crime since 1919. The NFL can say we've never had a game fixed in our history because, well, no one's ever been convicted or admitted to fixing a game in their history. I don't believe that either, but they can say it all they want because in a sad way, the proof is on their side for that matter. But what it is, I had information about a baseball game in 2012, and I've been investigating it. And I think I've been working with another guy who's a pretty nationally known writer, actually, on this for about a year now, and we've basically finished up the story, and hopefully it'll be published within the next couple of months. And I think when people read it and really read what Major League Baseball did in terms of their security division and their almost Gestapo-like drive to look into this case, I think it'll change people's opinions of how this league and probably other leagues operate, because they almost operated outside of the law. In fact, I really shouldn't say almost. They pretty much did operate outside of the law. And that's really almost more shocking than the whole thing about the potentially fixed game.
All right, and speaking of games being fixed, or more specifically, games being guided, first time I ever saw you on the Alex Jones Show, after you had already left that episode, a caller called in who claimed that he knew someone who used to play for the Los Angeles Clippers, was his roommate, I believe he said, and the caller, he insisted he's telling the truth. Alex said, well, I don't know if you're someone just making this up, but the caller, he did seem pretty sincere about this. He said that this LA Clippers player told him that the games are not, in the NBA, are not so much rigged as they are guided. The referees communicate with the players, he said, and said, foul this guy more than this guy. Don't try fouling this guy, because if you do, I'm not going to call it. Would you agree that fan is, or maybe he's not telling the truth about games being guided? And if he is, can you elaborate on that?
Well, it's amazing. I mean, I've been running my website, which is thefixesin.net, for, how long now? Quite a while, probably 6 years or so. And I continually get emails from fans and people, and I find it amazing that a lot of people who do email me have one story, a story about whatever, kind of like this guy on the Alex Jones Show, that they knew somebody or they were roommates with somebody or friends with somebody or whatever, and they have a story relating to some sort of corruption, especially gambling or game fixing. And it's not, I believe almost every one of them. And it's not because I want to believe them, but it's because it's a story, and it seems so credible because it's not like somebody said, well, I knew this happened, and then I knew this happened, and I knew this happened. It was always just, it was like they had this one story, this one secret, and they wanted to spill the beans to someone, and I've become that someone because I'll listen to them, and I'll respond to them and ask them questions. And like I say, I mean, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, I've heard from one guy who was the nephew of a major NBA referee, and he told me that they call on his uncle to make sure certain games go a certain way. I mean, that's the kind of story I've heard. I mean, I've heard other stories as well. Trying to think. I heard one about a baseball player and how he was offered steroids, and how there was a whole group of players who were offered steroids, and how that happened. And I mean, I just hear all different sorts of stories from people who don't know where else to go with their stories. So, like I say, they come to me, and I tend to believe them all because I don't think all this stuff is legitimate. So when you hear these sorts of things, somebody could be a great liar. Somebody could be making up a great story, and I could have fallen for it, or Alex Jones could have fallen for it. I mean, it's easy to do. But, again, it's not like they're saying, I know who's going to win the Super Bowl because I'm on the inside and blah, 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 blah. They're just saying, hey, I know this guy who did this, and that's it. And I think, when you put enough of these collection of these stories together, it adds up to the bigger picture.
Yes, in regards to the bigger picture, Tim Donaghy, this really opened up the big picture in terms of sports being rigged, that NBA ref who fixed games. I want to get into this because this was such a big story at the time, and I think Donaghy's still in prison, and he will be for a while.
No, he's out.
He is? Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Oh, yeah, he's out and about. Oh, yeah.
Okay, but just for the fans, people that don't know, could you get into the whole Tim Donaghy story and what kind of can of worms did that open for you and all the other people that do the work you do?
Well, it's funny because the Donaghy case broke almost at the exact same time I was finishing writing my first book, The Fix Is In. And it was kind of almost ironic that a lot of the stuff I was covering was coming out in his case. It was just kind of a real coincidence, if you will, not some, pseudo coincidence. But the short version of the Donaghy story, and it kind of depends who you want to believe, because there's Tim Donaghy's side, and then there's the other side, the bookie he was working with side, and they're not the same story. But the gist of it is Donaghy, who was a 12 or 13-year NBA veteran referee, he had a gambling problem. He liked to gamble, and he started betting on basketball games because obviously as an NBA referee, he felt that was the sport he knew the best. And when he fell into this with this gambler who was a one of the major sports gamblers in the world, and moved money all around the world. And that's one of the things about sports gambling many people don't understand, is it's not just a guy betting in Las Vegas or a guy betting $50 with their local bookie. To some of these guys, they literally manipulate the markets, almost like the stock markets in Asia, in Europe, in the offshore sports books in the Caribbean, in the illegal sports books in the United States. I mean, they bet everywhere, and that's what this guy did. Once he started working with Tim Donaghy, this bookie, he started betting literally millions of dollars on the games Donaghy was officiating, and eventually what happened was, like I said before, the FBI really stopped investigating for this sort of criminality in sports and sports gambling. They stumbled upon a wiretap in relation to another organized crime investigation where someone mentioned having the control of an NBA referee. So the FBI looked into it and came across this whole plot and busted it up, because otherwise Tim Donaghy would still be officiating probably in the NBA right now because he's one of their top-rated officials. And what they discovered was, and this is where the stories diverge, the bookie claims Donaghy was fixing the games, shaving points and what have you, in the games on which he officiated, and he was making, the bookie was making literally millions of dollars on every one of his games, and nobody picked up on this. Donaghy claims he was just giving this guy inside information on the games and not altering the outcomes of games whatsoever, and for every correct pick he would get like $2,000 or $4,000 or something minute compared to what this guy was gambling on these same games. But when people look at the stats retroactively, they saw that really because Donaghy claimed he was winning like 80% of his bets because he knew so much about the NBA. Well, when they looked at it, he was really 50-50 on games he wasn't officiating in, but on games in which he was participating, he was winning 80% or more, which is unheard of in the gambling world. I mean, if you win about 58% of your bets, you're considered a genius. Well, he's hitting 80%. So people are pretty certain that he was manipulating these games. But what happened was, once Donaghy got in trouble with the FBI and they came after him, he turned himself in, which was genius because it allowed him to control the message and allowed him to control the FBI in a very real way. And the bookie wouldn't work with the FBI. So Donaghy was able to tell his side of the story, and the FBI basically believed only his side of the story because they didn't have an alternate version to listen to. And I think that's one of the reasons why he never got convicted for fixing games, is because they had him on other charges. He admitted to the other gambling charges, and he was going to prison regardless. But what he also said was that what many people believe, and what I was writing about at that exact time, was that the NBA directs its referees on how to officiate games, and when to call fouls, when not to call fouls, who to give more leeway to, when to push a playoff series from a 4-game sweep into a 6 or a 7-game series so there's more people watching, more television, more advertising, more of everything. And he basically laid all that out there. And because now he was a convicted felon, well, of course, the likes of ESPN, Sports Illustrated, and all these other major sports media outlets that profit from the NBA, in many cases fund the NBA, labeled him a liar and said, well, that's impossible, that couldn't be happening, he's just saying that stuff to cover his butt. But the fact remains, I think he was being honest in this case, and I think he was spilling the beans because he knew he was done with the NBA and he was never going to work with the NBA again once he got busted by the FBI, and so he told the truth. And many people just didn't want to believe it, and the sports media, like I said, wouldn't report it because it threatened them and it threatened the integrity of the entire NBA.
Yes, and similar to players and referees fixing things, why don't we get into the Black Sox scandal? I made reference to it, but you didn't really elaborate on that. I'm sure you know all the real history behind that. And so can you get into that and also explain why the whole thing about, was Shoeless Joe Jackson falsely accused of the conspiracy? And if so, how did he get falsely accused if he wasn't even in on it?
No, he wasn't falsely accused. He should be banned with the rest of them. Shoeless Joe was involved in the meetings about fixing the games. Whether he fixed the game or not, it's hard to say from his play, but he did accept $10,000 from the gamblers regardless. So he's not clean and innocent like many sports historians want to make him be. And the fact is Major League Baseball at that time, 100 years ago, was incredibly corrupt. And it was infiltrated with gamblers, and in fact, it was basically considered a gambling sport. And many, many people bet on it, and many players were involved in fixing games, and many players actually got away with fixing games at the time because it was sort of a haphazard and not well put together league and organization at that point. It was just the fact the White Sox fixed the World Series in 1919, and it's possible the Cubs intentionally threw the World Series in 1918, the year before, and other teams might have thrown it even before that. It's just that it was so blatant, it was so obvious, and there were so many people involved that it blew up in their faces, and it blew up in baseball's face, and they had to come cracking down hard on gambling within the game because they knew, the owners knew, the guys who were making all the money off this knew that fans weren't going to watch a game that has become as corrupt as Major League Baseball was at that time. And so they had to institute these hard, fast rules against it to bring people back to the stadium. And it's really mirrored almost in the steroid scandal in the modern era, where people at first didn't care about steroids and didn't care about all these guys hitting home runs. The Baseball Writers of America didn't care about it. The owners didn't care about it because everybody's making money and having a good time. And then Barry Bonds was such a jerk about it that he kind of ruined it for everybody. And then there was this whole steroid and performance-enhancing drug backlash from the fans that Major League Baseball now is clamping down on steroids and saying, the game's clean and don't worry about it. We got it all under control, which is a bunch of PR. That's beside the point. But that's what happened with the White Sox in 1919. It was just so egregious that somebody had to do something about it, and Major League Baseball did. They clamped down, and whether they rightfully should have kicked those 8 guys out of baseball or not, it did send a good message, in my opinion, about gambling in sports. And one of my favorite things, actually, to come out of that trial, which is true today as it was almost 100 years ago, in defending the players when they went to trial, because they actually went to trial and were acquitted by a jury in Chicago of fixing the games. It was afterwards. It was in 1920 that they were actually banned by the new commissioner of baseball and thrown out when they were almost on the verge of going back to the World Series in 1920, and which decimated the team. But in that trial, the lawyer, the defense attorney, pointed out that the White Sox, and like I say, this is true today, weren't paid to win. They were paid merely to play, and that's what they did. They played. What did they do wrong? At the time, there was no federal crime of sports bribery where somebody was paying them to throw a game, so they hadn't committed a federal crime. I'm not 100% sure if it was a state crime at that point or not, but the main thing was is they were paid to play. They went out and played. They just didn't play very well. And that's really the case today. I mean, athletes, except for maybe some, maybe like some pitchers in baseball, they may have clauses, incentive clauses, where if you win 10 games or 15 games, you get an extra bonus money. But for the most part, players are paid to play. It doesn't mean they have to play well. Doesn't mean they have to play great. Doesn't mean they have to give 110%. They're just paid to go out in the field and do what it is what they do. And whether they make the tackle or miss the tackle or stop the goal or miss the goal, it doesn't really matter because they're getting paid either way. And that's kind of a way to look at this that I think is not normal for most sports fans, is that, these guys may be making $1 million and maybe they'll make $2 million next year if they play better, but maybe they won't because they've already signed a contract and they're going to make $20 million over the next 5 years. So, if they go out and don't perform very well today, it really doesn't matter one way or the other to them. They're getting paid to play.
Yes, and you said that gambling was very prominent in baseball back in those days. That's one of the reasons why in the 1888 baseball poem, Casey at the Bat, they said, we'll put a lot more money up if Casey were at the bat. That's symbolic of the fact that gambling was... Yeah, and by the way, this isn't really about sports being rigged, but since you know your sports history, I think I got the answer to this question from someone who's a baseball fanatic, but maybe you can confirm it for me. In regards to that poem, Casey at the Bat, one of the biggest mysteries that many people don't think about, but many people that do realize it think this makes no sense is, why wasn't Mighty Casey intentionally walked? because because the team was down by 2 runs. Casey was the game-winning run if he hit a home run. First base was open. They had runners on second and third. Because he was such a great hitter, and he was the leadoff hitter, by the way. In those days, the leadoff hitter was the best hitter on the team in terms of power, and it only made sense to intentionally walk him. Someone told me that poem, which was written in 1888, the idea of intentionally walking wasn't done because it wasn't done. The intentional walk was done in 1896, as a matter of fact, and the guy told me the story about this. And after the game, the pitcher, who was told by his coach to intentionally walk the batter, went into the coach's office and told him, "Coach, what the hell were you thinking? Why would you tell me to do that? Are you out of your mind? I don't want to play for a crazy coach." And the coach said, "Hey, it's all about strategy." And from that moment in 1896, the intentional walk was born, although I did hear something about in the early 1900s it was actually banned for a little while during I think it was actually near the beginning of the power era, after the dead ball era when Babe Ruth came into play. But can you confirm or deny that the reason Mighty Casey was not intentionally walked was because the intentional walk didn't exist at that time?
I have no idea, but that's a great story. That's a really great story. I've never heard that before. Never even thought about it, to be honest. But it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, baseball at that time was a completely different sport than the one we know today, and I'm sure it would be looked upon by the players as cheating, if not rude or wrong, to intentionally walk a guy like that. The thing about Casey, too, being at the bat is, at that time, what was really his threat of hitting a home run? There wasn't a lot of home runs hit back in that time. Why would they have worried about that? If he singles, maybe he scores a run, maybe 2. But, no, I've never heard that story. That's a great story.
Yes, it is. And want to talk about players being bad boys. One thing you've talked about before is that they don't care if athletes use steroids. If the athletes use more steroids, they'll get to be better, and that will draw the fans over. And I do remember reading an article in the New York Daily News where a anonymous whistleblower who was, I think, an athlete in the NFL said that in terms of drug testing, NFL players get tested anytime for steroids, but in terms of recreational drugs, they get one test and one test only, and that's a time period in the early summer between May and July. And what's interesting about this is players do get suspended for both recreational drugs and steroids, but I'm thinking there's no question about it. The owners and the coaches, they suspend the players selectively to make it seem like they don't tolerate it, when in fact they do. Now, would you agree, yes, they suspend players selectively, and do they maybe bribe the players and say, hey, if you agree to get suspended for this, we'll give you something to reward you? Would that happen too?
I don't know about suspending them and rewarding them for being suspended, but I think the drug testing program in every sport is simply PR. I don't buy it. I don't believe it's really effective, and I don't believe, especially in the case of steroids and performance-enhancing drugs, they want it to be effective. I think, like you say, that's true about the NFL drug testing, that they get tested once a year in the off season for any sort of street drugs, cocaine or hash or whatever else they may be taking, and the players usually know it's coming. And many of them have even said and written that you have to be a complete idiot to fail that test, because you know it's coming. And once you take the test, they're not coming back for a year, so you can do all the drugs you want because you're free and clear now. And I think that's the same with performance-enhancing drugs. A lot of times they know when they're being tested. I think Major League Baseball, you get tested for steroids when you show up at spring training, which would be right about now. So a player knows, hey, as long as I pass that test, I'm not going to get tested again in spring training. And then they only get tested maybe twice during the regular season in baseball. And yet it's been revealed that the teams know about 3 or 4 days ahead of time when the testers are going to show up. So again, a player who may be dirty has plenty of time to clean out his system and pass a drug test without any problem. Now, at the same time, certainly there's certain drugs, performance-enhancing drugs, that the leagues don't test for. And the NFL is notorious that they don't test for human growth hormone, HGH, which is supposedly taken. I had one guy who's a writer for the Professional Football Writers of America said that at least 75%, if not more, of NFL players are on HGH, yet the league's not testing for them. So none of them are going to fail a steroids test because they're all taking something that's not even being tested for. In fact, there's not even a urine test for HGH at this point. They have to take a blood test, and that's why they've had this big fight with the union over how they're going to administer that sort of test, because now supposedly they can test for it, but they're not testing for it. And that's the sort of thing. I think a lot of the drug testing is just simply PR because fans want, again, they want to believe the game is clean. They want to believe everybody is on a level playing field, and the fact is they're not. And the owners and leagues don't care because, let's face it, you know, these guys, especially in the NFL and to a lesser extent hockey and basketball and baseball, are almost superhuman in what they can do. How big they are, how fast they are, how far they can jump, how high they can jump, what they can do physically. That's one of the reasons we pay to go watch these games and want to see them on television and, you know, put these guys on a different, you know, a pedestal above us because of their physical abilities. Well, a lot of it's not natural. It's because they're on some sort of drug, and they've been on drugs. I mean, steroids have been in football since the 1960s, for crying out loud, and baseball since at least the 1980s, if not earlier than that. It's been going on for a very, very long time, and it's influenced games. It's changed the outcomes of games. It's probably determined championships. It's really manipulated games on a different level as well. And no one really, really cares. I mean, they're more concerned about, well, we don't want our high school kids doing this. If you're a grown man and you want to do this, you want to make your money, well, so be it. But that's kind of an ethical question, in my opinion. But I think one of the things with the drug testing program as well, which you kind of brought up, is the fact that I think if a player did test positive, if you had a guy like Ryan Braun who tested positive, and the league, since the league determines what's illegal in terms of drugs, when they get tested, who collects the samples, where the samples are tested, and then the league gets results. I mean, they control the entire thing. I think it'd be very easy for the league to go up to a player and say, look, you failed the test for whatever, steroids, cocaine, what have you. We can do one of two things here. We can either out you publicly as a steroid user, as a drug user, and make you go through all that, you know, rigmarole and all that negative PR and have to apologize to your fans and all that, or perhaps you play ball with us and you fix this game, or you do this for us, or you do that for us, and we make sure this positive test never comes to light. What do you say? What do you want to do? I mean, the leagues can do that. They have that ability. It's just a question of whether they've done it or not.
Yeah, in regards to players getting suspended, we all remember the whole thing with Pittsburgh Steelers quarterback Ben Roethlisberger sexually assaulted a woman, and the charges were never pressed. He never got convicted of a crime, but he was still suspended for 4 games for violating the NFL's personal conduct policy. And I once heard Jay Leno make a joke about this, and he said, oh, my God, the NFL has a personal conduct policy. I never would have known. So, I mean, I could imagine that while Ben Roethlisberger, even though he made it seem like he was remorseful for what he did, he still probably was thinking in the back of his mind, how dare the NFL commissioner suspend me for this when players who have actually broken the law and done worse don't get suspended? It's all the more proof that life is not fair. I mean, he was a superstar player, so you would think maybe they would cut him a break, but they didn't. Maybe they were actually just trying to send a message to the public, we don't tolerate bad behavior, but yet behind the curtain, they do tolerate it. Now, this is really confusing, if you know what I mean. So the whole Ben Roethlisberger thing, why do you think they came down on him like that, and why do you think their suspension policy is so selective in regards to personal conduct in football and other sports too?
That's an excellent question, and I don't think anybody outside of, you know, the league office has a good answer. I'm not even sure they have a good answer for that sort of thing, because you're right. For a guy who never was actually convicted of a crime, Roethlisberger got punished a lot more than guys who have been convicted of crimes. I mean, technically, Michael Vick spent how long in federal prison and was suspended for, I think 2 games. And yet Roethlisberger wasn't even convicted or even, I think, sentenced for a crime. And yet he got 4 games. I don't know. I don't know why the leagues do this. I mean, I think, again, it's part of the whole PR campaign where they want to say, hey, we're tough on crime, we're tough on this, we're tough on that. But at the same time, I mean, players get arrested for DUIs all over the place in every league, and nobody ever gets really suspended or in trouble for that sort of thing. Guys get busted for drugs, usually don't get in trouble for that. You just had Ray Rice of the Ravens on video beating his girlfriend unconscious and carrying her out of a hotel, and nothing has happened from the NFL at this point. There's a lot of criminality against women, a lot of beating of women, a lot of spousal assault that goes unreported, unpunished. There's a lot of crimes that these leagues allow these guys to get away with, and I think, again, part of it is they allow these criminals to play because they are elite athletes, and there are just so many out there. I mean, I know a lot of players are really kind of cogs in a big machine and are replaceable, but there are some that it's really hard to play at that elite level athletically in any of these sports. I mean, they are special to a certain extent because of that. But at the same time, if the leagues were really true about their integrity, if they are really committed to outing this criminality, they could eliminate all these guys. They could really clean up the game. They could send a hardline message, almost like the commissioner did in baseball in 1919 with the White Sox and expelled these guys. They could do that if they wanted to, but they don't want to, and they don't have to because the fans don't care. And that's the biggest thing to me. And the biggest solution to all of this problem is if the fans would react, if they want to clean up these sports, if they want drugs out of sports, if the performance-enhancing drugs or otherwise, if they want the criminals out of the sport, if they want cleaner games, better officiated games, then it's really up to the fans. They have to stop watching. And that's the hardest thing, is they're addicted to these sports like a drug. But if they stopped watching, if they stopped paying attention, if they complained louder, they would actually be able to change the sports, because if the sports don't have fans, they won't make money. If they don't make money, they won't exist. So if the fans can react in the right way, they can actually change the sports that they love and get them into a more pure and clean slate. But the fans won't. They'll just sit there and watch, and they'll keep tuning in, and they'll bitch and moan about, this player or that player, and, he's a drug addict, he should be kicked out or whatever, but they won't do anything about it. They won't actually voice their opinion and change things. I mean, they did to a certain extent almost in baseball with the Barry Bonds and the steroid thing. It hasn't completely cleaned up the game. I think it has helped, but it has completely cleaned up the game because the fans let it go. They continue to show up in record numbers, and baseball's making more money than it's ever made before. But the fans can actually change the game if they wanted to and if they tried to.
Yes, in regards to the fans, I think this is worth pointing out. I've heard people say that if you get involved with watching sports and rooting for a team, you are putting yourself in a mode of my tribe versus your tribe, if that makes sense, and that will divide and conquer humanity. Now, do you really believe that we should be very selective and cautious about watching sports and rooting for teams simply because it puts us in a my tribe versus your tribe, divide and conquer state of humanity?
I think it's something people should actually kind of be aware of, sure. I mean, the first thing I wrote in the Fixes In, and I think it's a very valid question to ask for anybody who watches sports regularly to ask themselves is, why do you care? Why do you even watch sports? And I think if you actually honestly answer that question, you may have a surprising revelation about yourself, or you may come to realize, well, really I shouldn't care. Maybe I shouldn't be watching sports, but it's true. I mean, what you talk about is very true, is it does divide and conquer people in that way, because there are many psychological effects to watching sports. Like I say, one of it's this basking in reflective glory, where you feel good when the team or player you root for does well. And that can be somewhat beneficial to you, but it can also be addictive. And there's also that other thing about, you say, like tribal effects, where people, wear the same clothes, they paint their faces, they get all geared up for the game, and that sort of thing. And, as we've seen recently, people beating each other almost to death outside of stadiums and setting them on fire because they're wearing the wrong type of clothes or they're rooting for the wrong team. I mean, it's gotten to a very, very scary and negative point. I mean, I live in Wisconsin, and you go to a game, which shouldn't be that big of a deal because neither team is good, and I've seen fights, I've seen drunkenness, I've seen all sorts of horrible, horrible behavior just because one guy's rooting for the Brewers and one guy's rooting for the Cubs. You're not playing the game. It doesn't matter that much to you people. Let's just enjoy the game. If that's what you're there to do, just enjoy the game. But people can't. They've taken it to an entirely another level, and it shows how addicted they are to these sports and how much control these sports have over them, because they'll exhibit behavior that they wouldn't exhibit anywhere else. I mean, it's not going to happen at a movie theater necessarily. It's not going to happen at the zoo. But at a sporting event, apparently this is fine and normal behavior.
Yes, and the fans being affected, I don't know if you've done much research on this subject, but in regards to subliminal advertising in sports, I mean, we all know subliminal advertising works. The Coca-Cola company, way back in the day when movies had intermissions, would flash Coca-Cola across the screen, and that would cause all the people watching the movie to get a Coca-Cola. Well, there's in-your-face evidence that subliminal advertising obviously does work. And on a related note, the Super Bowls have been highly Illuminati, some of them. There was the one where Beyonce flashed the triangle symbol with her hands, and the power was out for 33 minutes for the 33rd degree of Freemasonry symbolism, and the 1,000 points of light of the Yale University Skull and Bone Society, and the fans when that power outage happened. That was the Super Bowl with the Ravens and the 49ers, and I guess that is subliminal advertising. And Alex Jones even said, my God, I don't know if I should have watched some of that Super Bowl like I did, because he said it was still affecting him the next day in terms of brainwashing. Have you done any research on subliminal advertising and also Illuminati advertising in the sports world and how it affects people?
No, I never really got that far into it on that level. I mean, I was more, like I say, my more focus was on the actual control of the sports themselves, the manipulation within there. But that sort of thing, it doesn't surprise me, because like I said earlier, I mean, they invented the 2-minute warning specifically to sell advertising. I mean, that's why it exists, and I think that's the reason they play the games is to make money, and one of the ways they make money is by selling ads. And like you say, you can't watch a game in any way, shape, or form and not be subjected to all sorts of advertising, be it on the outfield wall, be it on the boards at the hockey game, be it the name of the stadium, for crying out loud, you know. Stadium, you have to say the name of the stadium is, you know, insert your corporate logo, stadium. That's where we're watching from. And I mean, advertising is everywhere within the sports world, and when you have people in this different state of mind and this heightened emotion of watching sports and cheering, it's a great way to get your message through to them and sell them what you want them to buy.
Okay, I think we'll be getting into the martial law stuff momentarily, but one more thing I want to talk about in regards to sports is, why is it that some athletes in some sports do more criminal activity than in others? I mean, there's criminals in all sports, but the NFL and the NBA, it seems notorious that there's always a headline somewhere across the ESPN bottom line or some other article which talks about how an NBA or NFL player got arrested for some crime, and it doesn't happen anywhere as much with NHL, MLS, and MLB players. I don't know about overseas sports like cricket and soccer, which of course are not popular in America, even though soccer and cricket are actually number 1 and number 2 respectively on the most popular sports in the world list, if Americans can believe that. But the point is, why is it that some sports, the athletes are more criminal-like off the court than they are in other sports?
My best guess, and this is just a guess and an assumption, is that it's because sport, especially football and basketball, I think you corrupt almost the player at a younger level, if you will. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is so much corruption in our professional sports, and why it's not discussed by the people involved, is because if you think about it, at least in my opinion, you know, if you're good at basketball or football, really by middle school, you're almost elevated above everyone else in the school. And especially when you get to high school, if you're to college, if you're to, you know, the basketball star or the football star at your high school, you're elevated, you're treated differently. And let's face it, here come the colleges now, and the colleges know you're one of these star players, and they'll start recruiting you, they'll start corrupting you. They start giving you money under the table, boosters start feeding you stuff, you get cars, you get women, you get all this stuff to come to this college. You go to that college, and again, if you're an elite enough star, you're put on even a higher pedestal now at college, and you're the big man on campus, and they give you money under the table, and they give you jobs you don't have to go to, and they give you all this other stuff. And then here come the agents who are going to recruit you to come into the pros, and the agents start giving you money, and they start feeding you things, and you're just treated differently. And then once you get into the NFL or the NBA, you know, since you were a little kid, all you've learned is the corruption. You've learned that you're special, that you can't get into trouble, basically. And I think that's why you see more NFL and NBA players do get into trouble, because they don't even realize, especially they've been treated all their life, and they assume that's going to continue. And I think in many cases, you know, the league security divisions do cover up a lot of the crime and criminality that goes on in these leagues, but certain times, you know, police officers just won't fall for, do you know who I am? that they're going to say, I don't care who you are, you broke a law, we're going to arrest you, we're going to do this to you, and they get into trouble and it comes out more. But I think that's the root of it all, is that they've always been treated special and allowed to be treated special, and they don't know any better.
Okay, thanks. And I think that may actually be it in terms of sports, unless maybe some random question comes into me. But most people don't give you credit for this book that you've written in regards to martial law and continuation of government. So I guess you might as well spend the last half hour talking about the material in that book, just so people can be aware of the other things besides sports that you've done in life. So this book that you've written that many people don't know about, what is it about? Talk about it for a little bit. You got the floor on this, and then I'll ask you some questions that are pertinent to it.
Well, I wrote Disaster Government basically because you can only read about and talk about and look at sports so much that I had to look at something else. I mean, it was really just kind of almost like a side project, just so I wouldn't have to think about sports. And what it was is I was always interested in like underground bases, and I was always kind of interested in the plans the government had developed to survive a nuclear war dating back to the 50s, even before that, I suppose. And I wanted to write a book about all this because I always felt it got short-shifted, and that too many times people would cherry-pick certain things and they wouldn't write about it in the right light. And so I kind of set out to write, I guess, for lack of a better term, a conspiracy theory book about all of this. And the more I researched, and the more I got actual government files and files that were once top secret and files that came out of the Freedom of Information Act and other places, I realized this isn't a conspiracy theory by any means. It's the honest-to-God truth of how the government is set up. And what I came to basically realize is that the government, the federal government, has legally set itself up to be overthrown, and be overthrown to have a coup and to be taken over in a very martial law. The president is now the emperor type of fashion. And it all comes out of this continuity of government planning, which was started, again, basically to survive a nuclear war. And it's a very double-edged sword, because on one side, a lot of the planning that the government has designed and developed, it does make perfect sense. I mean, if you want to help people recover from a disaster, be it a natural disaster or a war, a lot of these plans make perfect sense. But on the other side, if you want to talk about what is a national emergency and what can be done to combat a national emergency, these are things, like I said, that have set up all the dominoes to legally overthrow the United States government and change the way we all live.
All right, and on the subject of the police state in regards to sports, I'm going to try to combine the subject here because we all saw at the Super Bowl there was massive police state activity, and the TSA was also there. Since I mentioned the TSA, I might just want to point out that it's kind of pointless to try to sue the TSA from a rights standpoint, and it's not because some people are sheep-like to accept the TSA as necessary for safety. The real reason you can't win a TSA lawsuit is because, at least at your airports anyway, they label you as passengers on your ticket, and passenger is a commercial term, and by agreeing to get flown on that plane, you're putting yourself in commerce, which the government can regulate, so it's okay to violate your rights, and they actually don't want you to know that. Thought I'd just point that out for everybody so they know that the TSA relegates you to cargo. I hope that makes you feel really disgusted, because it should, because it shows just how much the government cares for us that they would do that to us. But the point is, the TSA and the police forces have been put all around the sports stadiums, and there was a story coming out on the some sports sites that talked about how Major League Baseball next year is going to have searching everybody at the stadium. It's all really designed to be security theater under the guise of safety. They don't care about our safety. They just want us to think they do, and they use the Boston bombing to justify it, even though that was so obviously a staged event. But anyway, the point is, have you looked into this stuff in regards to police state and TSA activity at sports stadiums and how it's designed to condition the general public?
To a certain extent, yeah. I mean, I found it really interesting going back to that blackout you mentioned at Super Bowl 2 years ago. The reason why I think the blackout was a staged event was basically kind of from what you just talked about, is the fact that the Department of Homeland Security has issued numerous threats and assessment warnings and that sort of thing, saying, look, if terrorists are going to attack us again on U.S. soil, whether you believe they've ever done that in the past or not, let's play devil's advocate. If they're going to attack us on U.S. soil, one of the best things they're going to go after would be a sporting event, because it would be something that would be live on television. It has a lot of people packed into a tightly, compressed space, and a small bomb could do a lot of damage, or whatever, it could do a lot of damage right in that kind of event. And they've issued numerous warnings. They've been, talking to all the major leagues about this sort of thing. And then, as you said, you've seen the police state that was almost enforced in New York City for this last Super Bowl, and where they supposedly had snipers on the ready and all this other thing just in case something happened. Well, here you had the blackout at the Super Bowl, and nobody panicked. And to me, that was the telltale sign, is the lights went out. Nobody knew why. It could have been an explosion. It could have been some sort of, hacker attack. It could have been a lot of things that caused it, and yet nobody panicked. And to me, that was a telltale sign that it was orchestrated and planned because of that. Because if there really was all this security and all this preparation for such a threat and whatever, you would have seen, security guys and the players have been rushed off the field, and, it would have been a complete lockdown. But instead, everybody was just milling about like no big deal, nothing happened. That's why I think it was all staged.
Yeah, and I also thought it was staged. Funny coincidence, it was out for 33 minutes. Alex Jones pointed that out, how that symbolizes 33rd degree of Freemasonry. But I think I want to talk for a little bit about the recent Olympics and the security theater there. First of all, just for the hell of it, was there any corruption that you uncovered in regards to the sports aspect of the recent Winter Olympics that were in Russia? And also, what was your overall take on the whole police state conditioning thing that was going on around the Olympics under the guise of safety?
Well, corruption-wise, from the sporting thing, there wasn't much. I mean, I think there was only... I got to remember the Winter Olympics are a lot smaller events than the Summer Olympics. There's fewer athletes, fewer countries, and all that. I mean, I still think they caught, I want to say, at least 5 athletes for doping through their urine tests and whatever, which they didn't make a big deal out of. But it's still, at least 5 that got busted, which means 4 had to be taken, and especially in skiing events and endurance-type events like speed skating. The thing I found interesting in regards to like the security and all that is how, and it's really not surprising, but how little NBC mentioned any of that. I mean, for the United States, the NBC was basically the only coverage we had of this, worldwide sporting event. And NBC really made very little mention of the security. They made very little mention of the corruption in terms of how it cost $51 billion to even put those games on, which is ridiculous. And then they failed to really mention all the flaws in terms of, the hotels not being finished and the venues not being completely finished. I mean, they really just wiped that out and wiped that clean and just gave us the, everything is fine mantra, and I don't think that was the case.
Okay, thanks for giving your take on that. And in regards to your book, Disaster Government, in your research, I'm sure you've looked into how the government is preparing for a disaster. Based on what you've seen, can you maybe give any advice to the general public and the listeners on how we should prepare as the common people for a disaster in government like the kind that you talk about in your book, and how to prepare from a preparedness, I'm ready to survive this standpoint?
Well, I think one of the big things that the federal government points out, which it doesn't do a very good job of actually warning people, is the fact that in the event of a disaster, be it a hurricane, an earthquake, a war, whatever, they say you have to be prepared to survive on your own for at least 3 days, that we're not coming to help you for a good 3 days. And, I mean, I think if you look at, like, what happened with Hurricane Katrina and all the people showing up at the Superdome and all the other nonsense that happened in New Orleans, that's kind of proof positive that that's the way they operate, that they're not coming to your rescue. And I think a lot of people assume they are going to be right there and ready to help you. And the honest to God truth is the federal government isn't planning on helping you. They're not coming to your rescue anytime soon in the event of such a disaster. I think if you're going to support any sort of outlet in terms of helping you, you have to look to your local first responders, be it, police or fire or even the National Guard. They're more likely to be the ones on the case when something bad goes down, and they're going to be the first ones to help you. But the main fact of the matter is, even with them, is you need to be prepared yourself in the event of a disaster, and you need to be prepared to make it on your own for a period of time, a lengthy period of time. And I don't necessarily mean you have to go to the extreme prepper end of things, but if you want to be honest and serious about it, you need to be prepared, I would say, for at least 2 weeks' worth of supplies in the event of some sort of disaster or emergency.
Yeah, I want to talk about the government for a little bit here, because I remember you mentioned earlier that you, in your work researching, getting evidence from the FBI with the FOIA requests that you've filed, you say you think the FBI is pretty legitimate in what it does. Well, the FBI is compartmentalized, and so is everything, in the sense that people who work there think they're doing what their job is supposed to be doing. They think they're helping out everybody. They're just doing what they're told, thinking that, okay, this is the way my job is supposed to be. It all makes sense, but they don't realize that higher in the ladder of authority above them, there are people that have malevolent intentions for humanity, and I'm sure that is the case with the FBI. So in your quest to get stuff from the FBI, elaborating on your claim you think the FBI is legitimate, do you think the FBI is compartmentalized in the sense that the people at the bottom of the ladder of authority think they're doing good when the people at the top are flat out evil?
I don't know if the people at the top are flat out evil. I don't know if I'd go that far, but I think you're right. I mean, I think the government's a ginormous bureaucracy. And the people, like you say, the people at the bottom have no idea what the people at the top are doing or what their intentions are. And I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I know, the FBI is definitely compartmentalized. I mean, I think a lot of these agencies are very compartmentalized in that, you have to go up through the ranks to really kind of learn about what really the intention and the grand scheme of things are. I mean, when I filed Freedom of Information Act requests from U.S. Northcom and some of these other places for writing disaster government, and it's amazing. It took me 3 years to get like one bit of information out of U.S. Northcom, and it just kept getting bounced around from all these different areas. I mean, we went from the Department of Defense to Northcom to somewhere else, back to the Department of Defense, back to U.S. Northcom, and then finally they released something that was so redacted I couldn't even make heads or tails out of. But that's the way they operate. And so, it's not surprising to think that the compartmentalization really takes the lower level employees out of the equation, and the higher up you go, the more you know what's really happening.
Yes, and the government you can't trust in regards to coming for you in protection for a disaster, but in your research in doing this book and also looking into the whole disaster government scenario, I want to talk about for a moment about the government engineering its own disasters. There is a lot of evidence that Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, they were caused by HAARP or some weather modification technology, and the Gulf oil spill down in the Gulf of Mexico was engineered and designed to happen as a depopulation agenda so they could exploit that area for its resources. And also in the Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura episode on the FEMA camps, the police state one, which only aired once because True TV and Alex Jones and Jesse Ventura's crews, they all got threatened for the episode, so it only aired once. They talked about how the government might release some sort of a virus in the public in order to justify imprisoning people in the FEMA camps, which we know they exist because leaked U.S. Army documents confirm that they exist. So can you offer any comments on the government engineering the disasters that you have become concerned about?
Well, the funny part is they don't even need to do any of that to initiate what you're talking about. In reality, now, one of the things that, and it's probably been a year since I counted, but at my last count, there's something called the national emergency, okay? And if a national emergency is declared, and it can only be declared by the president, it opens up a whole lot of legislation to combat said emergency. And these are things like they can ration food, water, and energy. They can tell you where to work. They can tell you what kind of wage you're going to work for. They can confiscate your personal vehicle. They can control the airwaves. They can control the roadways. They can control the waterways, the airlines. They can control everything if they want to based off a national emergency. Well, by my last count, when I wrote the book, I want to say the United States of America was under 24 separate national emergencies, all at the same time, okay? And now, technically, the government could take in any one of those and instituted all of these horrible, horrible plans that they have to combat a national emergency. They don't necessarily need a virus. They don't necessarily need a hurricane. And in fact, our hurricanes, despite how devastating like Sandy was and Katrina was, they weren't even national emergencies. They weren't that big. The stuff that is a national emergency is really kind of off-the-wall stuff. I mean, 9/11 is still a national emergency today because it keeps getting renewed every year, if you believe that. 9/11, something that was an event for a day, is still a national emergency here, 12, 13 years later. I mean, things like terrorism is a national emergency. The conditions in Zimbabwe, the conditions in Haiti, the conditions in Belarus are all national emergencies, and I think many of the reasons those are national emergencies is because if we want to, we can send troops in there, and we don't have to declare war or anything like that because the national emergency allows a loophole for that sort of thing. But these national emergencies can do, like you say, exactly what they want to do. If they want to round people up, and they do have lists, and they've had lists literally since the early 70s, if not before that, and I have some of this information in Disaster Government. They have lists of people who are they consider dissenters and who will be rounded up and locked away for no reason other than the United States government has labeled them dissenters, and that list has grown and grown and grown, and it's become, part of the no-fly list, and it's become the terrorist watch list and these sort of things. And it's, like you say, unfortunately now it's getting to the point of, people who defend the Second Amendment and people who talk negatively about the government are on this list now. Like you say, all they need is the right tipping point to put all this stuff into motion and to round people up and get them out of the way and take over. And that's what Disaster Government's really written about, all of that sort of thing.
Okay, and I want to talk about another potential disaster, the idea of war, specifically a third world war. There are two possible scenarios in regards to how a World War III would start. It could start in Korea, where the North invades the South, or vice versa, and the allies of North and South Korea would all come to the aid, and then those countries would all go in some sort of an all-out war with each other, where everybody coming in to help their allies, when in reality the Illuminati forces control both sides of the war, and the bankers in particular fund both sides of the war. And there's also the possibility that a third world war could start in the Middle East, specifically Iran getting invaded, Iran invading someone, or someone invading Iran, like Israel, and Iran going at war with each other, and then the allies of those countries, just like the possible scenario in Korea, would come to each other's aid, to Israel and Iran's aid, and they would duke it out with each other. Now they want this third world war, the Illuminati forces do, so they can create a global totalitarian government and impose martial law. Do you cover the scenario of a third world war causing martial law in America and the rest of the world at large? And if so, what have you uncovered?
Well, I don't cover it specifically in relation to a third world war, but I do talk about martial law and its implementation. And again, that can come out of a national emergency. That can come out of that sort of thing. And obviously, another war would probably be declared a national emergency because so many other events like, Iraq and Afghanistan are national emergencies today. And it's interesting in a way that, when the government was started, or, what we consider started back in 1776, by I think it was 1806 or 1808, 20, 30 years after, we declared our independence, we passed something called the Insurrection Act, which basically made it illegal for anyone to try and overthrow the government, to have another revolution, which is funny because that's how our government got started, was by a revolution. Now they just outlawed anybody else having a revolution to take over the power of the people who just took over power. But that allows for martial law anybody who basically is deemed an insurrection against the United States government, and that it can include protesting, that can include just not following the law. If it's declared, that can create martial law. That can send in the troops. The thing with martial law, and the one thing that I find interesting is that, there's, and I'm not even sure the number because I don't think it's ever been declared, how many soldiers are stationed at U.S. NORTHCOM, and their area of patrol is the United States of America. Martial law can be declared, but I don't think, and I could be wrong, but I don't think there's enough troops to really enforce martial law nationwide. I think you can institute martial law within a city, even a major city, New York, Chicago, LA. I think you can do that, and you can do it probably in multiple cities. But you can't enforce martial law nationwide in the United States. I think the United States is too big to our own advantage for regular people. It's too big. But that being said, obviously with the FBI and the ability to round up people who are considered dissenters, enough martial law is declared, it'll scare enough people. It can really put a good clamp down on the United States of America. And again, all these things are set up, and that's the scary part, is all these things are already in place. There are already laws passed, there are already laws written, executive orders on the books, and one's waiting to be signed when all they need is, the powers that be just need that tipping point. They just need that one event that they declare is, this is it, this is the tipping point, and they can put all this stuff into motion. And to stop it and prevent it it almost sounds impossible, unfortunately.
Yes, Brian, we have about 7.5 minutes left, so one more subject I want to get into. We did mention the FEMA camps a little bit, and like I said, the FEMA camp episode of Jesse Ventura's show got canceled after one airing, and a couple of radio show hosts, including Mancow, have had their radio signals blocked when people talk about FEMA camps. I don't think they're going to block my signal, so I think to the best of your ability, Brian, I'd like you to explain what you know about the FEMA camps that you think the people need to know. You have 7 minutes to cover everything you know about the FEMA camps.
Well, the FEMA camps, it's one of those double-edged sword things. I mean, after Hurricane Katrina, when they didn't know what to do with the million or so people who were displaced because of the flooding and everything else, they started putting them in trailers that were formaldehyde fumed, just incredibly bad places. They gave them gift cards. They put them in hotels. They just didn't know what to do with these people. So on one hand, if you think about the FEMA camp, it makes sense, okay? If we have a major disaster of that kind again, we need a place to house people. So why don't we build these camps perhaps on, Army grounds where they can have medical service, they can have food, they can have water, they can have everything they need, and they can be protected. That doesn't sound half bad. It's not a bad idea. But there's a huge but here, is the fact when you go back, again, like I said earlier, about the fact that the FBI and the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security now, has these lists of dissenters, that they have these people who they deem basically criminals without being criminals, and these are the people that they will round up and likely put in these camps when the bad things happen. It's kind of frightening because we know they exist, and like you say, on one hand they exist for probably a very good reason, but on the other hand, and the hand that everybody is more afraid of, is they exist for a very bad reason, and that's basically to become in prisons and prison camps for people who the federal government wants to get rid of. People like you and me.
Yes, I think they would put us at the top of their list of people who they want to imprison, although, as I discussed with one of my previous radio show guests, Eddie Craig, the more determined you are to get angry if they threaten you, the less likely they are to threaten you for being a whistleblower. I asked Eddie, why is it that the stuff that you've done to turn people into diehard patriots and keep money out of the hands of the corrupt tyrants in government, how come they haven't threatened you for this like they've threatened other whistleblowers? And he told me, well, if they threaten me, it would only make me more angry and more determined, and they realize it's not in their best interest to threaten me because they know that it's going to backfire on them, and whether or not they kill me remains to be seen. But the point is, the harder and more determined you do your stuff to expose corruption, and if you make it clear to them that you're going to get angry and work harder if they threaten you, then you can expect them to leave you alone. They're going to go after the whistleblowers who are more timid, for lack of a better phrase. So it's good to keep a stiff upper lip and keep fighting. So, yeah. I
think you're right. I think actually, I kind of do the same thing in sports, is to fight against the powers that be. And I think if more people on every level, if you want to fight sports, if you want to fight the federal government, whatever you want to push against, I think the more determined you are and the more determined people become, and especially in terms of taking back the government and taking back control from these powers that be that have just destroyed this country from what it really was at the beginning, I think the more we fight, the more they would lose. I really do. I think if people weren't so afraid, because I get asked that all the time on radio shows, aren't you afraid somebody's going to come and shoot you? Well, yeah, maybe that would happen. Maybe. I don't know. Who cares? If it happens, it happens. But I'm not going to let that fear stop me from doing what it is I want to do, what I want to try to accomplish. If they have to come and shoot me to stop me, then come and shoot me and stop me. And when the bullet's going through my head, I'll realize, hey, I was right, then that they got me. But I think if more people, like I say, fought against, the corruption and the problems that we have in this nation, instead of being afraid and just sitting back and watching TV and just saying, well, hopefully it'll all pass me by, I think we'd all be much better off.
Yes, we would, and we'd also be much better off if we didn't put ourselves into a my tribe versus your tribe mentality and rooting for a team and making it our whole entire life. So maybe a 3-hour baseball or football game on Sunday is a nice way to take a vacation from your hectic life, but if you obsess about it, then it's going to be a problem. So with that being said, Brian, you've got 2.5 minutes to talk about what you're planning for your future work. Is there anything in regards to what you're planning with your work in the future that you want your fans and my listeners to know about?
Well, the main thing, I think, if people want to follow me, if they're interested in what I do, is they can go to my website, which is thefixisin.net, and I also have a smaller website called disastergovernment.com that talks about my books, talks about what's in there. It includes other writings that didn't make the book or didn't fit in with the book, and things that have come up since the book has been released. Both books have been released. All the books have been released, I should say. And that's the best way to follow what I'm doing. I mean, I still do some sports writing. Amazingly, I've kind of been hooked up with this USA Today affiliated website called sportsonearth.com, which actually has allowed me to write some of this kind of quote-unquote conspiracy theory type stuff. But it's given me a mainstream outlet to kind of put some of this corruption and give it some light and get people thinking about sports hopefully in a different way. And that's my main goal, is to get, like you mentioned, is to get people to be okay. If you want to watch a baseball game, if you want to watch a football game, you want to take 3 hours out of your life and just chill out. Instead of going to a movie, you watch football. Cool. I have no problem with that. But you have to be a more educated fan. You have to be more realize that these are huge, monstrous businesses, multi-billion-dollar industries, and they're trying to suck every dollar, every penny they can out of you. And in many ways, they're sucking your life away from you. The more you become committed to it, the more you put your life into it, the more you're actually losing. And that's what I want to do, is I want to make fans more informed about this sort of thing and make them rethink the way they watch sports and why they're watching sports. That's kind of my goal.
Oh, Brian, can you hear me? Oh, yes. Sorry,
Yep.
It took me a couple seconds to unmute there for some reason. Okay, but yeah, I'm not the sports fan I used to be, as I mentioned earlier, because people like you woke me up to that. So anyway, Brian, it was a great show. I'm especially glad I was able to cover that stuff in regards to disaster government, because you don't seem to get much credit for that. I hope people will find that interesting. This video will be uploaded to YouTube, this interview, so this information gets out to the public. Mark my words on that one. But since this interview is about to end, I'm going to tell you the same thing I tell all my guests. Even though I think you're a fascinating individual, and I'm sure the information is worth listening to again, my goal on this radio show is to get as many different people on the show as possible before giving any one specific guest double dips. So if you do hear from me again for a radio show interview, don't expect it to be in the near future, because I got a lot of other people who deserve some glory on my show. But it was a pleasure, man. I really was glad I was finally able to get you on. Yeah, thanks. I hope you enjoyed this, and I do hope a lot of people will listen to you. So keep up the good work, Brian. It was great having you on. And if I get any sports-related evidence or info, I'll definitely email you about it.
Definitely. I appreciate it, Andrew. Thanks for having me on tonight. It was a good time.
All right, thanks a lot. Take care, Brian. Bye.
You too. Bye.
Bye. Well, folks, I hope you learned something from that, because I certainly did. I mean, some of this stuff was preaching to the choir in regards to the sports stuff, because I heard Brian on the Alex Jones show, but wanted to cover the stuff that wasn't really covered there, and I'm sure I did a pretty good job of it. Couldn't think of any other sports-related questions to ask. That's why I went to the continuation of government stuff. Hope you learned something from that. The FEMA camp stuff is especially critical. So anyway, in regards to the future, I am scheduled to have Jason Martell on it next Wednesday. He was supposed to be on yesterday, but he got a cold, so he couldn't come on. And I was actually supposed to have Dr. Joel Wallach of Longevity.com, a health and nutrition expert, on my show next Wednesday, but he couldn't come on, so Jason Martell is now able to fill the slot. We'll be talking about extraterrestrials, ancient astronaut theory in the past, present, and future, and also that stuff about Zecharia Sitchin. We'll be talking a lot because he strongly advocates the work of Sitchin, and I do too. We will get into why Sitchin's theories are not as crazy as some people think, and how they should rewrite human history on planet Earth, and also Eric von Daniken's work, and also talk about the show Ancient Aliens, because Ancient Aliens, I do have a sort of love-em, hate-em relationship with that show on the History Channel. I'm watching all the episodes. including the new ones that are airing presently. And I'll probably catch that new UFO show on the History Channel that's going to debut this upcoming Friday. I do hope there's not a lot of disinformation in there. If it is, I'll probably realize it. But we'll talk about that on the show. Ancient Astronaut Theory UFOs with Jason Martell. And hopefully I'll be able to get Dr. Joel Wallach on sometime in the week after seeing Jason Martell before I get my next scheduled show on Wednesday. So namaste, everybody. Have a wonderful night. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful experience throughout consciousness. Namaste.